I'm Margaret Lane, 68 years old, and until that night, I thought I knew exactly who my family was. It was less than 24 hours after my son Daniel's backyard wedding to Sophie. The house still smelled faintly of lemon cake when I heard her voice through an old baby monitor tucked in my dresser drawer. She was laughing low and sharp, telling someone she'd only married my son for my house. The tea in my hands went cold before it reached my lips. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe because I knew in that instant nothing in my life would feel the same again. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever discovered the truth about someone when they thought you weren't listening. I've lived in the same cedar-framed house on the edge of town for over 40 years, first with my husband, then raising Daniel after we lost him in an accident. The place sits at the top of a sloping yard with tall pines sheltering the windows by midday. I worked in the community library most of my adult life, shelving books, organizing story hours, greeting neighbors by name. My world was steady and modest, built on the values my parents passed down: hard work, quiet kindness, and never taking more than your share. Every creak in the floorboards, every mismatched mug in the cupboard had its place in the story of my life. Daniel grew up with that same sense of home. He'd play the piano in the front room until the light faded, recording himself on an old cassette deck and making me listen to every note. After my husband passed, it was just the two of us sharing dinners at the worn oak table, sometimes going weeks without locking the front door because trust still felt natural here. I knew life had changed for Daniel when he met Sophie. She was polished, confident, the kind of woman who filled a room without trying. I welcomed her warmly, believing her smiles were as genuine as they looked. The wedding was small, held under a canopy of late summer sky. Friends and a few relatives sat on folding chairs, the air filled with the smell of rosemary and grilled chicken. Sophie kissed my cheek, thanked me for baking the cake, and I believed her gratitude was real. But that night, in the quiet hallway, with towels folded in my hands, I heard her tell someone she was only waiting to wrap things up, and that I had no idea what was coming. My body felt rooted to the spot, my mind grasping at the memory of every kindness I had shown her. I walked back to my room slowly, the house looking unfamiliar in the soft lamplight. It was still my home, but the air carried something sharp, almost metallic, beneath the scent of jasmine from the porch. I didn't confront her. I didn't even tell Daniel. I set the baby monitor's receiver on the bookshelf in the living room, replaced the batteries, and left it on. I've lived long enough to know that when something breaks this suddenly, you don't rush to repair it. You listen, you wait. The next morning, Sophie moved through the kitchen as if nothing had happened, unpacking boxes and adjusting curtains she'd brought with her. She spoke to me with polite ease, her hands already placing her mark on spaces that had stood untouched for decades. Daniel was at work, and the walls seemed to echo in a new way. I knew then this was not simply a matter of personality or taste. Something deeper had shifted, and the quiet I had always trusted no longer felt like safety. By the end of that first week, I could see the outline of her presence pressing into every corner of the house. The cushions on the sofa were different, the record player gone from the living room, a cherished photograph missing from the mantel. I told myself these were small changes, that I was being sensitive after living alone for so long. But her words from that night kept threading their way through my thoughts, each syllable reminding me I had overheard them for a reason. What I didn't know then was just how far Sophie's plans reached, or how patient she would be in seeing them through. Sophie moved into the house the same evening she and Daniel were married. There was no conversation about it, no suggestion that we might ease into the arrangement. She wheeled her suitcase through the front door, as though it had always belonged to her. Daniel seemed pleased carrying her smaller bags, and chatting about their honeymoon plans while I stood near the hall table trying to take in the new shape of things. Within an hour, Sophie had set her handbag on the kitchen counter, claimed the guest bathroom as her own, and hung a fresh set of clothes in the hallway closet. The first change came the next morning. The curtains in the living room, the ones I had sewn from a heavy floral fabric years ago, were folded neatly in a pile by the door. In their place hung sheer white panels that let in more light but erased the sense of privacy I'd always valued. I noticed the record player had been pushed into a corner, the stack of vinyl albums placed in a cardboard box. Sophie said the room would breathe better without bulky furniture. I nodded, though the space already felt different, like its memories had been shifted just out of sight. Over the next few days, the changes multiplied. The cushions on the sofa disappeared, replaced with new ones in pale gray. The old lamp with the yellow fringe was gone from the corner. Photographs I had displayed for decades began to move first from the mantel to the bookshelf, then to a box in the guest room. One afternoon, while vacuuming under the bed in that room, I found a framed picture of Daniel at age 5, holding a stick like a sword, while my late husband laughed in the background. I had once kept that photo where anyone could see it. Now it was hidden beneath a spare blanket. Sophie started referring to the house as our home whenever guests visited. She gave tours, pointing out features as if she had overseen every choice that shaped it. Once in the kitchen, she told a woman that the space had potential but needed to be opened up. I was standing not 3 feet away when she smiled at me, her tone as casual as if I were a neighbor passing by. Daniel didn't appear to notice. His work at the clinic kept him busy, and when he was home, Sophie kept the conversation moving, leaving little room for quiet observations. The shift was gradual but deliberate. She never told me to move or suggested I was in the way. Yet I found myself stepping aside, more often yielding the center of a room so she could pass, waiting to speak until her stories were done. It was like being gently edged out of the frame in a family photograph. I began to sense that her choices were not simply about style or preference, they were about removing traces of me from the place I had made a home. Late one evening, I went down to the basement. The air smelled faintly of cedar and the boxes stored for years. In the far corner sat a wooden chest I hadn't opened in a long time. Inside were my husband's letters, a set of handwritten instructions for the boiler and the property deed. My name was the only one on it. I placed the deed into a folder and slid it into the drawer of my bedroom dresser under the old baby monitor. Holding that paper reminded me that no matter the changes happening upstairs, the foundation of the house was still mine. The following morning, Sophie announced that she and Daniel would be hosting a dinner for his colleagues from the clinic. She handed me a list of recipes and said it would be nice if I could help. I spent the day cleaning the kitchen, setting out the good dishes, and polishing a silver tray that had been in my family for generations. Just before the guests arrived, I stepped into the pantry and turned on a small recorder I had tucked onto a shelf. If Sophie intended to speak freely when she thought I wasn't listening, I wanted to keep her words intact. The dinner went smoothly by outward measures. Daniel's co-workers complimented the food, admired the view from the back porch, and listened as Sophie spoke warmly about their recent wedding. I stayed in the kitchen, bringing out dishes and clearing plates, following her unspoken direction to keep to the edges. At one point, she referred to me by my first name rather than Mom or Mrs. Lane, as she often had in the past. It was a small shift in address, but it settled in my mind. After the last guest left, Daniel helped me stack the dishes and thanked me for everything. Sophie had already gone upstairs. I waited until the house was still, then retrieved the recorder and sat at the kitchen table. Most of what I heard was ordinary conversation laughter, the sound of glasses being set down. But then Sophie's voice came through clearly. She called me harmless and said she doubted I knew what day it was half the time. A man's voice, one I didn't recognize, asked her what came next. Sophie replied that she would give it a few weeks before bringing in a doctor who could help with cases like mine. She said that once an evaluation was done, Daniel would sign whatever she put in front of him. Hearing the name of a doctor, someone she trusted to advance her plan, left no room for uncertainty. This was not about furniture or curtains. Sophie was moving toward a legal foothold that could remove me from my own home. I didn't sleep much that night. The house was silent, but my mind kept replaying her words, fitting them into the pattern of changes I'd been watching for days. In the morning, I moved through my routine as usual. I made coffee, toasted bread, and kept the radio on the classical station. Sophie didn't come down until late. She thanked me for cleaning and poured herself a cup of coffee. Her tone was easy, but behind it, I heard the confidence of someone certain her plan was unfolding as intended. Later, I climbed the narrow attic stairs for the first time in years. I knew exactly what I was looking for. Wrapped in a wool blanket in the far corner was my late husband's old recording kit, 2 reel-to-reel decks, directional microphones, and a pair of heavy headphones. I carried them down piece by piece, cleaned them carefully, and set them up in the study. The equipment still worked, the tapes turning smoothly, the sound crisp. Over the next several days, I tested microphones in different parts of the house, the dining room, the living room, behind a bookshelf in the den. I wasn't looking for particular conversations. I was listening for the moments when Sophie forgot to measure her words. If she had spoken this openly already, she would do it again. I only needed to be ready. By Friday, my patience was rewarded. From a microphone hidden behind a framed map in the hallway, I recorded Sophie on the phone with the same man as before. This time, I caught his name, Victor. She told him she needed him to stay patient, that Elijah was close to giving her co-ownership of the house, and that she just needed a medical report from the doctor to file the claim. She laughed as she told him the house was their future. When the recording clicked off, the room seemed even quieter than before. I had no doubts left. Sophie was not simply rearranging the house. She was building a case to take it from me, and she believed she had all the pieces lined up. What she didn't know was that I had begun collecting my own. I began adjusting my days so I could be alone in the house when Sophie made her calls. Some mornings I would leave early for the market circle back and slip quietly into the study to check the reels. The recordings always told me more than she realized she was giving away. A half-finished sentence, a laugh at the wrong moment, the confidence of someone who thought she had full control of the board. I kept my own routine steady on the surface. Breakfast at the kitchen table, laundry folded in the den, radio set low in the background. Underneath, I was planning. I moved one microphone into the vent above the hallway to catch her conversations when she walked from the kitchen to the guest room. Another went behind a vase in the corner of the den. Each placement was deliberate, meant to blend into the rhythm of the house. The more she spoke, the more the shape of her plan took form. She talked with Victor about timing, about making sure Daniel believed the guardianship was for my own good. She hinted at selling the house, even mentioned a real estate agent in town. Her tone was always light, almost playful, but every word was another stitch in the net she thought she was weaving around me. I decided to give her something to work with. It started with the coffee pot left too long on the burner one morning. Sophie came into the kitchen, sniffed at the smell, and asked if I'd forgotten about it. I apologized without a trace of irritation, telling her I must have gotten distracted. A few days later, I put a sweater in the freezer. When she found it looking for frozen peas, I smiled and said maybe I had been dreaming while tidying up. The little incidents piled up. I misplaced the remote and later found it in the linen closet. I left the radio playing static in the sunroom for an hour before turning it off. Each time Sophie filed the moment away without comment, her eyes giving away more than her voice. It was exactly what I wanted. One afternoon, I set the stage in front of Daniel. He came in from the yard to find me at the kitchen table, one slipper on and an oven mitt on my other foot, flipping through the phone book. I told him I was looking for a bakery but couldn't remember the name. It was July, and the bakery was supposedly for his November birthday. He looked puzzled, but didn't press. Sophie stayed silent, letting him notice on his own. A few days later, I tucked the car keys inside the piano bench under Daniel's childhood sheet music. That evening, I told them I must have left them at the grocery store. Later that night, the reel-to-reel caught Sophie on the phone with Victor, saying it was time to call the doctor again. She listed the incidents, the stove, the keys, the freezer, as proof I was becoming a danger to myself. Dr. Ellis arrived the next morning. Sophie greeted him at the door with concern in her voice and tea already brewing. He asked me questions in the living room, my name, the date, who the president was. He had me repeat a series of words, count backward, and draw a clock. I missed one of the words and placed the clock's hands slightly off just enough to be memorable without raising alarm. When the questions ended, he stepped into the hallway with Sophie. I caught part of their conversation through the reflection in the window. He said my disorientation was mild, nothing conclusive. Sophie pressed him, asking if it was enough to raise legal concerns. He replied that with more documentation, it might be possible. I filed that exchange in my memory and labeled the tape Ellis Visit 1. The following week, Sophie grew more confident again. She spoke openly on the phone about selling the house by fall. She told someone she had already contacted the agent. She believed Daniel would sign whatever she put in front of him, and with Dr. Ellis's report, the rest would be just paperwork. She didn't know that every word was being stored in duplicate, one copy here, another somewhere she couldn't reach. I carried myself as though nothing had changed. In the mornings, I made oatmeal and left it on the counter until it congealed. I went for walks and came back with one shoe muddy and the other clean. I hummed lullabies on the porch when no one was around. Every action was designed to be small enough to pass as harmless, yet memorable enough for her to mention later. It worked. I heard her tell Victor she was almost ready to move forward, that Daniel wouldn't even realize what he was signing until it was too late. She promised him the guest room in the back, describing the light from the window and the fireplace, as though she already owned it. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that she was moving on a timetable. I needed to be ready before she reached the final step. I gathered the most damning recordings and stored them in a small canvas bag, along with the backup drive and a few essentials. It wasn't an escape bag. It was a safeguard, a way to be ready if she tried something sudden. I waited for the moment when her urgency would overtake her patience. It came late one morning. She placed a stack of mail in front of Daniel, pointing to an envelope from the State Medical Review Board. She told him to sign so they could get ahead of things, calling it routine paperwork for emergencies. Daniel picked up a pen but paused, asking what it was really for. Sophie's smile was quick, too quick. She said it was nothing, just precaution. He set the pen down and told her he would look at it later. I saw the faintest flicker of annoyance cross her face. It was the first crack I'd seen in her expression since she moved in. That small hesitation told me Daniel had started to ask his own questions, and once those began, her certainty would start to fray. The morning after Daniel set down the pen, instead of signing, I decided it was time to take my evidence outside the walls of the house. I packed a canvas tote with the property deed, my notebook of dates and quotes, and a flash drive with the clearest recordings. I left early, not telling either of them where I was going. The air was cool and the road into town was quiet, except for the sound of tires on asphalt. The Lane County Courthouse sat between two older brick buildings on the main street. Inside the front desk, clerk looked up when I gave my name and gestured for me to follow her. She brought me to an office where a woman named Grace greeted me with a calm smile. She had reading glasses hanging from a silver chain and a way of listening that made you feel she wasn't going to interrupt. I laid the deed and my notes on her desk, explaining I needed certified copies. Then I slid the flash drive toward her and said I needed advice. She plugged it in, put on a set of headphones, and listened to several clips without speaking. When she removed them, her expression had shifted. She told me there was someone else I should meet. She led me down the hall to a door without a nameplate. Inside, a man in a gray blazer stood to greet me. He introduced himself as Thomas Callahan, legal liaison for elder safety concerns. He didn't rush me. He waited until I was done speaking before taking any notes. When I finished, he said there were steps we could take to make sure no changes to my property or legal status could be made without a hearing. Mr. Callahan explained a motion to freeze any asset transfer could be filed quietly, and a formal review could be requested if a medical evaluation was submitted under questionable circumstances. He told me I already had what most people didn't: detailed records, names, and proof with clear dates. He recommended making 2 duplicate hard drives, one to remain at the courthouse and one for me to keep somewhere secure. By the time I left, both drives were labeled and logged. I also signed a request for formal review in the event any medical declaration about my competency was filed. As I stepped outside, the sun was higher and the sidewalks were warming underfoot. I walked to a cafe a block away and sat at a corner table with coffee and a sandwich, letting the next step settle in my mind. When I came home that afternoon, the house was still. Daniel's car wasn't in the drive, and Sophie was in the sunroom with a magazine. She looked up briefly when I walked past, then turned her eyes back to the page. I went into the kitchen, took the backup drive from my bag, and hid it behind a jar of buttons in the pantry. That evening, I placed another recorder inside the light fixture in the upstairs hallway. It was a newer model, smaller than the others with better range. If Sophie and Daniel spoke there after going to bed, I would hear it. I knew she wouldn't stop pressing forward. She was too close to what she wanted to slow down now. 2 days later, I caught her on the phone again. She told Victor she'd already spoken with the real estate agent, that they had a soft listing ready to go. Then she added something she hadn't meant to say. She'd made a call from my phone to start a guardianship inquiry, making it look like I had initiated it myself. That night, I checked my outgoing call log and found the number she'd mentioned. It belonged to a regional elder care consultant. I printed the log and added it to my file. The next day, I called Mr. Callahan from the public library. He said the new information would help accelerate the review process and told me to keep everything documented. At home, Sophie began watching me more closely. When I asked where the crackers were, and then asked again 15 minutes later, she smiled faintly without answering. I returned the look with the same softness, as though nothing unusual had passed between us. Daniel didn't comment, but I noticed his glances were longer now, as if he was starting to measure things differently. One afternoon, I overheard Sophie in the living room, her voice low but clear enough. She told Dr. Ellis I had asked if we were in Oregon or Nebraska that morning. She said the papers should be ready for Daniel to sign by Friday, and that she'd tell him it was for insurance. I stayed in the kitchen, rinsing a cup, my back turned, listening to each word. That evening, I added the newest recording to my growing collection. Then I gathered the most critical files, digital copies, call logs, transcripts, and placed them with the backup drive in a small bag under my bed. I wasn't planning to leave, but I was ready for the moment. Sophie decided to push harder. By Thursday, Daniel's movements had changed. He came home early without announcing it, his footsteps slower as he walked through the house. Sophie was outside trimming lavender when he opened the desk drawers, the hall closet, and finally the cabinet where she kept household files. I stayed in the den pretending to work on a crossword, but I could hear the sound of folders being set aside. That night at dinner, Daniel was quiet. He glanced at Sophie between bites, his face giving little away. Sophie talked more than usual, her voice carrying just enough brightness to fill the silence. After the dishes were done, Daniel lingered near the hall closet again. Sophie called his name from the other room, but he didn't answer right away. When he did, his tone was even and distant. She slept in the guest room that night, saying she had a headache. I sat in my bedroom, going over the last few weeks in my mind, the careful steps, the staged forgetfulness, the moments caught on tape. I knew what was coming next. Daniel was no longer seeing Sophie's story as the only version. Daniel came into the kitchen early the next morning. his steps slow, his expression unreadable. He poured coffee, then sat across from me at the table. "I found these," he said, sliding a manila envelope toward me. Inside were 3 forms bearing my name, each one signed, none in my handwriting. I looked up at him, waiting. He said he was sorry that he should have seen it sooner. I told him everything then, about the recordings, the meetings at the courthouse, and Mr. Callahan's advice. I explained how I'd kept track of every call Sophie made, every slip in her words, every attempt to create a false trail. Daniel didn't interrupt. When I finished, he stood and walked out to the back porch. I stayed where I was, listening to the creak of the screen door and the quiet scrape of his chair on the boards outside. Sophie came home not long after. She greeted Daniel brightly, but something in her tone wavered. He didn't respond. She went upstairs, the sound of her steps quick and light. I could hear her moving around in the guest room drawers, opening and closing. Daniel returned 20 minutes later, carrying a small box from the UPS store. He set it on the table and pushed it toward me. Inside was a new digital recorder with cloud backup and a small prepaid phone. Mr. Callahan's number was programmed into the first slot. "I should have protected you sooner," he said. That night, Sophie was careful. She made dinner, offered to do the dishes, even asked if I needed anything from town the next day. Daniel watched her from the hallway, his arms folded loosely across his chest. She noticed and kept her smile fixed. I knew she wouldn't give up without trying something more decisive. Before going to bed, I placed the new recorder in the vent above the hallway. I tested the connection twice to make sure the sound was clear. The prepaid phone went into the linen closet under the flannel sheets. The rest of the house settled into its usual nighttime rhythm, except for the faint shift of footsteps past my door after midnight. I counted slowly before following. Sophie was in the study, the light from the desk lamp catching the edge of her hair. She was going through the drawer where Daniel kept household documents, flipping papers quickly, her lips moving as she spoke into her phone. I couldn't hear the other voice, but her tone was clipped and urgent. After a few minutes, she shoved the papers back in, closed the drawer, and slipped out of the room. The next morning, Daniel told me she had tried to take the backup drive, but hadn't found it. We sat together at the kitchen table, the low light from the window falling across the grain of the wood. Neither of us spoke for a while. The moment felt like a pause before the last move in a long game. 3 days later, Daniel came to me with an idea. He suggested a dinner, just the 3 of us, nothing elaborate. He would cook, and Sophie wouldn't suspect anything. I agreed, not for the meal, but because I understood what he was preparing for. That morning, I swept the porch and wiped down the windows. The air smelled faintly of dry leaves, and a cool wind hinted at early autumn. Daniel left to shop for groceries, returning with bags of vegetables and a whole chicken. The smell of rosemary and garlic began to fill the house by late afternoon. He set the table with the good china and lit a pair of candles. Sophie came down just before 6, wearing a wine-colored blouse and too much perfume. She hesitated at the sight of the table, then smiled when Daniel told her he thought it would be nice to eat together. We began with small talk, weather, neighborhood news, the upcoming harvest festival. Sophie laughed once or twice, but her fork scraped too hard against her plate, and her eyes moved between Daniel and me as if trying to gauge the terrain. Halfway through the meal, Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He set it beside his plate and began to read. His voice was steady as he outlined the forged forms, the call records, the conversations I'd recorded. Sophie's face lost its color before he was halfway through. By the time he finished, she was gripping her water glass. Daniel looked at me, then giving me the floor. I told her I had copies of everything on the cloud, on drives stored outside the house in files with Mr. Callahan's office. I listed the dates she'd spoken to Victor, the night she tried to have Daniel sign the guardianship papers, and the midnight search in the study. Sophie didn't speak. Daniel walked to the sideboard, and returned with a small envelope. He opened it and laid the original property deed on the table, along with a notarized statement confirming that Sophie had no legal claim to the house. "I want you out," he said quietly, "tonight." She started to protest, but he cut her off. "If you're here in the morning, my mother will call the police." Her chair scraped as she stood. She looked at Daniel, then at me, but said nothing. 30 minutes later, we heard her car pull out of the drive. I sat at the table, the candle flames bending in the draft from the hallway. Daniel came back from the kitchen with 2 cups of tea, setting one in front of me without a word. The house felt lighter, but I knew the situation wasn't finished yet. Sophie was too calculating to vanish entirely. The house felt different after Sophie left. The silence wasn't the heavy kind that had settled in over the past months. It was softer, as though the walls themselves had loosened their hold on something. Daniel moved through the room slowly the next day, making eggs in the kitchen, then pausing in the hallway to study old photographs. I let him have the space, knowing some thoughts needed time to settle before they could be spoken aloud. That evening, he found one of the cassette tapes from his childhood. It was labeled in his own handwriting, "Daniel, age 8, rainy Tuesday." He placed it in the tape deck and pressed play. The piano was hesitant at first, a little uneven, followed by his younger voice laughing. Then my voice came through, distant but clear, encouraging him to keep going. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, and listened until the tape clicked off. When he looked over, there was no need for him to explain what he was feeling. Over the next few days, we began putting the house back together. The sheer white curtains Sophie had hung were replaced with the blue floral ones I had sewn years ago. The sofa cushions returned, and the mantel once again held the photo of Daniel as a child, with my late husband standing behind him. It wasn't about erasing every trace she had left. It was about restoring what belonged here. On Monday morning, an envelope slid through the mail slot. The return address was a law firm in Portland. Inside was a cease and desist letter from Sophie's attorney, accusing us of defamation and emotional distress and demanding a settlement for damage to her reputation. Daniel read it in silence, his jaw tightening slightly. I had expected something like this. I called Mr. Callahan and explained what had arrived. He confirmed Sophie had no standing. We had the notarized affidavit, the property deed in my name, and the recording stored in multiple locations. He offered to respond formally and file a protective order if needed. I agreed, not because I wanted to push back publicly, but to set a clear legal boundary. Life began to find a new rhythm. I returned to walking the trail behind the house in the mornings. The air was cooler now, the trees starting to show early hints of gold. One morning, Daniel joined me. We sat on the bench at the trail's edge, looking over the field. He said quietly, "She almost had me. She told me I was helping you, that you needed someone to take care of things." I didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the grass, and we both watched it for a while before walking back. Later that week, we made a list of everything Sophie had tampered with: financial accounts, health records, old family documents. In the back of the study's locked drawer, I found a draft of a letter she had never sent to my doctor. It implied I was showing signs of confusion and paranoia, describing incidents that never happened. I placed it carefully into the evidence folder. Daniel started therapy the following week. He didn't call it making amends, but I could see it was part of the work he wanted to do. We also agreed Sophie would never be allowed back for any reason. If she needed to collect anything, it would be through the sheriff's office. The locks were changed, and we installed a small camera on the front porch. 3 weeks after Sophie's departure, her presence still lingered in small ways. Daniel sometimes hesitated before opening a drawer, as though expecting to find something missing. One morning, while trimming the holly bushes, he mentioned that an old friend of his from high school had reached out Samantha, a name I hadn't heard in years. She had heard about what happened and wanted to check in. Samantha came by that afternoon with a basket of cinnamon rolls. We sat outside, the three of us, talking about simple things: the garden, Daniel's work, a neighbor's new fence. She didn't mention Sophie at all, and I appreciated that. Daniel seemed lighter around her, his voice easier, his hands still when he spoke. That evening, as we sorted through old folders, Daniel paused at the one labeled estate planning. He asked if I wanted to make changes. I told him I already had 2 weeks after Sophie first moved in. I had kept everything in my name and created a separate trust for him that would only be accessible after certain personal and financial milestones were met. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "I would have failed that list 6 months ago," he said quietly. Later that night, I found him sitting on the back porch, writing in a notepad. In the morning, he handed me the paper. It was a letter to Samantha. Not romantic, but a simple thank you for reminding him that kindness could come without strings attached. I folded it carefully and handed it back. The attic was next on our list. Dust rose in thin clouds as we opened old boxes. There were holiday decorations, photo albums, and a wooden frame I hadn't seen in years. Inside was a picture of me in my 20s, holding Daniel as a baby, my husband's hand resting on my shoulder. Sophie had taken it down within a week of moving in. Now it was back in its place on the living room wall. The house felt more like itself each day. The changes weren't loud, but they were steady. Even in the quiet moments, I could sense that the ground we'd reclaimed wasn't going to be lost again. A Wednesday morning in late October, an envelope arrived with a Seattle law firm's return address. I let it sit on the counter while I finished my tea, the weight of it enough to tell me what might be inside. When I finally opened it, the pages were crisp, the language formal. Sophie was attempting to challenge the trust, claiming undue influence, and questioning my mental capacity. She referenced moments from the past and bent them to her advantage, using them to paint a picture that wasn't true. I drove into town and went straight to Mr. Callahan's office. His secretary saw the envelope in my hand and waved me in without a word. He read the petition carefully, setting each page aside with deliberate care. When he finished, he said simply, "It won't hold. She has no evidence, and your evaluations are current and clean." Still, he recommended a preventive response with an affidavit from Daniel, confirming I acted of my own will. That evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with pen and paper, drafting the statement in his own handwriting. He didn't rush it. His words were clear, without embellishment, each line confirming my decisions had been my own. The next day, I signed my own affidavit, and Mr. Callahan filed them both. A week later, Sophie's legal team withdrew the petition without explanation. The day after we received notice, I went out to the garden. The ground was still damp from overnight rain, and the air carried the scent of wet leaves. I knelt to prune the roses, each cut steady and measured. For the first time in a long while, I felt the quiet was my own again. As autumn deepened, the snow began to creep down from the higher ridge. My mornings started earlier now, not from unease, but from a sense of readiness. Daniel had taken on a consulting role with a small firm in town, nothing that demanded long hours. He still came by several times a week, helping with groceries, fixing small things around the house without being asked. One Saturday afternoon, I went through the study drawers again, organizing what Sophie had left behind. In the bottom of a locked file, I found another draft letter to my doctor unsent. It claimed I had left the stove on all night and forgotten Daniel's birthday things that had never happened. I placed it in the evidence folder, not because I needed it anymore, but because it belonged with the rest of the record. A few days later, Daniel joined me on the back porch with 2 mugs of coffee. The air was cold enough that steam rose from both cups. We sat without speaking for a while, watching the low sun move across the trees. I kept thinking she was trying to help you, he said finally. That she was the one keeping things steady. His eyes stayed on the yard, but his voice carried the weight of someone who had looked back and seen too much. We had already agreed Sophie would never return, not to collect anything, not to explain, not to try again. If she sent someone in her place, we would contact the sheriff immediately. The locks had been changed, and the front porch camera was active. Those were measures we could see, but it was the unspoken understanding between us that felt like the strongest safeguard. November brought the first light snow. Daniel was clearing the walk one afternoon when a familiar car slowed in front of the house. It didn't stop, but we both saw the driver someone Sophie had been close to in town. The car moved on, leaving 2 parallel tracks in the fresh powder. We didn't speak of it, but the sight stayed with us. Inside the house was warm. The blue floral curtains hung in the living room. The old lamp glowed in the corner, and the photo on the mantel caught the late-day light. The space looked settled again, yet we both knew the next test could come without warning. We didn't have to say it aloud. The quiet that settled over the house after Sophie's departure was different from anything I'd known before. It wasn't empty or hollow, but filled with a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. The floors seemed to creak more gently, as if the walls themselves were exhaling after holding their breath for so long. Daniel moved through the rooms with a new ease, sometimes humming while he made coffee or fixing the door that had stuck in the hallway. We didn't erase all the changes Sophie had made. The blue floral curtains returned, but the old photographs stayed where they were. It wasn't about undoing every mark of her time here. It was about reclaiming the house as ours again, in our own way. One evening, Daniel pulled out a box of old tapes from the closet. He placed one in the player, and the sound of his childhood piano filled the room. I sat beside him quietly, letting the music and memories wash over us. Legal battles and cease and desist letters came and went, but they never unsettled us the way Sophie's presence had. Mr. Callahan stayed in touch, ready to step in if needed, but the house felt safe now, guarded not just by locks and cameras, but by the strength we'd rebuilt together. The toughest part was healing the silence that had grown between Daniel and me. He started therapy not just for what Sophie did, but for the years of quiet distance that allowed her to come between us. We didn't rush to fix what was broken. We simply chose to move forward one honest conversation at a time. One chilly morning, as I sat near the garden pruning roses, Daniel came to join me. We didn't talk much sometimes. Words aren't what's needed most. Instead, we sat side by side, hands busy with thorns and petals, sharing a calm that felt like forgiveness and understanding, without having to say a thing. Life has a way of reminding you what really matters. I learned that kindness isn't just something you give others, it's something you owe yourself. Resilience isn't just about standing tall after the storm. It's about choosing to grow even when the ground feels uncertain. If there's one thing I want to leave you with, it's this: when someone tries to erase you or rewrite your story, remember you have a voice that deserves to be heard. Your worth isn't defined by the battles you face, but by the grace with which you meet them. If this story has touched you, I hope you'll share your own journey in the comments below. We all carry pieces of each other's strength, and if you're still finding your voice, take your time. It's yours, and it will always be there waiting.